in a really small wooden vessel, terribly cramped, terribly crowded, eating salt or spoiled food.
In the shadow of America's first colony, a chilling truth lay buried for centuries. Until now, beneath the grounds of Jamestown, ancient DNA has unearthed secrets no one was meant to find. Proof of cannibalism, a nobleman's hidden disgrace, and a teenage girl's tragic end. As science peels back the layers of history, what really happened during those harrowing days in the New World is far darker and more human than anything ever recorded. Join us as we uncover ancient DNA of Jamestown settlers. The founding Jamestown. In the spring of 1607, 3 English ships, the Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery, made their way to the shores of what we now recognize as Virginia. Aboard these vessels were 104 settlers, predominantly men, who brought with them more ambition than readiness. After months of sailing across the Atlantic, they were commissioned by the Virginia Company of London, with their expedition financed by affluent investors who viewed the New World not as a fresh start of freedom, but as a chance for wealth, expansion, and fame. The settlement they established was named Jamestown, in tribute to King James I. This was not England's inaugural attempt at colonizing North America. Roanoke had met with failure years prior, but Jamestown was the first to struggle for survival, albeit barely. The settlers, many of whom were gentlemen unfamiliar with hard work, anticipated discovering gold, similar to the Spanish conquests in South America. Instead, they encountered mosquitoes, brackish water, and the onset of calamity. From the outset, Jamestown was a gamble, militarily, economically, and spiritually. It was as much a religious venture as a commercial one. The Church of England saw the colony as a way to plant Protestantism in the New World, a wall against Catholic Spain, and a civilizing force for the so-called savages across the Atlantic. Among the settlers was Reverend Robert Hunt, who conducted the colony's first religious services under a makeshift sail draped over poles. He would later become one of the first colonists buried at Jamestown, his remains identified centuries later through DNA. While the vision painted Jamestown as a new Eden, the reality was something else entirely. Disease swept through the colony within weeks. The swampy terrain bred malaria, dysentery, and heat stroke. Salt poisoning from drinking contaminated river water slowly destroyed their bodies. By the end of the first summer, nearly half the colonists were dead. Still, more arrived. As part of the expanding colonial mission, each wave of settlers brought new hope and new tension. The settlers weren't all peasants or soldiers. Some were second sons of noble families, hoping to carve out power or fortune they'd never inherit back home. Others were craftsmen, artisans, or indentured servants promised land after years of labor. They came with contracts, titles, religious convictions, and expectations shaped by privilege. But the land didn't care who they were. And then there were those who were already present, the Powhatan Confederacy, a coalition of Algonquian-speaking tribes under the leadership of Chief Powhatan. The dynamics between the settlers and the native tribes were in constant flux. Initially, friendly trade turned into suspicion. Misunderstandings escalated into violence, and as settlers encroached on more land, the Powhatan retaliated. By the autumn of 1909, a complete siege had commenced, isolating the colony from trade and hunting territories. The settlers found themselves confined within their fortifications, facing dwindling resources. This initiated the Starving Time, a harrowing period that would claim the lives of over 80% of the colony's inhabitants. However, for centuries, the complete reality of that winter's events remained obscured, both literally and in historical accounts. The Virginia Company dispatched optimistic letters, while survivors provided sanitized stories. The portrayal of Jamestown had to be safeguarded. The foundation of English America could not be established on the basis of failure. Yet beneath the heroic depictions and triumphant slogans, the colony was disintegrating. Hunger morphed into madness. Desperation eclipsed decency, and some individuals resorted to the unimaginable in their quest for survival. For centuries, rumors of cannibalism have lingered. Early colonial documents suggested its existence, recounting instances of colonists consuming rats, dogs, and even shoe leather. One governor, George Percy, unsettlingly detailed his experiences of exhuming corpses. However, these stories were frequently dismissed as exaggerated stories intended to dramatize hardship or stir sympathy. Yet, they were indeed factual, not merely in metaphor, not simply in hearsay, but in flesh and blood. It would require over 400 years, the digging of a cellar pit, and the insights of ancient DNA to substantiate these claims. What was revealed in that pit, and in the burial sites of prominent settlers nearby, would upend our understanding of Jamestown. It would not only illuminate their way of life, but also unveil the secrets they concealed. The Starving Period. By the close of 1609, Jamestown staggered on the brink of disaster. The once promising settlement had devolved into a self-imposed prison. Agricultural failures plagued the colony. Tensions with the Powhatan Confederacy escalated into outright conflict. Local tribes, weary of English expansion and unfulfilled agreements, encircled the fort, severing all access to food and fresh water. That winter, infamously dubbed the Starving Time, would mark the colony's darkest period. Confined within the wooden barriers of James Fort, approximately 300 settlers endured the harsh winter with scant provisions. The once hopeful aspirations of conquering the wilderness shifted to a more fundamental objective: survival. Hunting proved futile. Trade had ground to a halt. Even the river, which had once been a source of sustenance, now provided only brackish water and illness. Desperation drove them to consume dogs, cats, rats, mice, and even the leather from their belts and shoes. And when those resources were exhausted, they turned on one another. One of the few eyewitnesses to survive, George Percy, penned a tormenting account of the despair he witnessed. He recounted how colonists dug up dead bodies from graves and consumed them. These were not mere exaggerations. They were the documented observations of a man who witnessed Jamestown descend into a state far beyond mere hopelessness. But even Percy's testimony was suppressed. His writings were buried in archives, rarely included in colonial retellings. The Virginia Company had too much at stake. Investors in London needed good news. They had poured money into a venture that promised riches and dominion. They could not afford a story of madness, starvation, and cannibalism. And so, the truth was buried in letters, in sanitized history books, and beneath the soil of Jamestown itself. Only 60 settlers survived that winter. When supply ships finally arrived in the spring of 1610, they found a scene so terrible that the leaders considered abandoning the colony altogether. One settler described the survivors as mere shadows of men, wandering the fort like ghosts. For years, the Starving Time existed in historical limbo, too horrific to ignore, but too scandalous to fully acknowledge. Cannibalism was often mentioned as a rumor, a desperate legend whispered between facts. Skeptics questioned whether Percy exaggerated, whether his words had been misinterpreted or manipulated, and so the darkest detail of early American history remained shrouded in doubt. Until 2012, during a routine excavation at James Fort, archaeologists from the Jamestown Rediscovery Project made a discovery that would rewrite the record. In a trash pit, a place where colonists threw food waste, animal bones, and broken tools, they found the partial remains of a young girl. She had been hastily discarded among garbage, but the cuts on her bones told a story far more deliberate. Her skull bore sharp, jagged marks, signs of post-mortem butchering, not violence. Someone had tried to remove her cheeks, her tongue, and her brain. Her shin bone was broken in a way consistent with attempts to extract marrow. These weren't the wounds of murder. They were the marks of desperation. She was given a name, Jane. Though her real identity remains unknown, forensic scientists were able to piece together her story. She was around 14 years old, from southern England, and likely of upper social standing, based on her rich, protein-heavy diet. She hadn't starved to death. Her bones showed no sign of long-term malnutrition. Most likely, she succumbed to disease or starvation late in the winter, and then someone used her body as a final attempt at nourishment. The cuts on her bones were hesitant, uneven, likely made by someone unfamiliar with human anatomy. It wasn't a calculated act, it was an act of agony. For centuries, cannibalism in Jamestown was debated. Jane's bones made it undeniable. Her remains were sent to the Smithsonian Institution, where scientists reconstructed her face and conducted isotope and DNA analysis. In 2013, they presented the findings to the world. It was no longer just a rumor, it was evidence. Graphic, scientific, humans. What next did science reveal to the world? What science revealed? Next came Captain Gabriel Archer, one of the original leaders of Jamestown, and, interestingly, a man who often clashed with John Smith. His grave featured a ceremonial staff and an unusual coffin arrangement. Most surprising of all, he was laid to rest facing east, which goes against Anglican tradition. This could imply potential secret Catholic sympathies, a risky association in Protestant England and among devout colonists. DNA analysis verified his age and probable origin, but his atypical burial suggested deeper ideological rifts brewing beneath the colony's surface. The third grave belonged to Sir Ferdinando Wenman, cousin and steward to Governor Thomas West, Baron de la Warr. He passed away shortly after his arrival in Jamestown in 1610. His burial reflected his noble status, complete with a coffin, shroud, and careful orientation. Once again, DNA was crucial in confirming not only his identity, but also the familial connections among these early leaders. Their diets revealed another story, one of imbalance amid disaster. While many ordinary settlers were found to have endured prolonged malnutrition, these high-status individuals exhibited little sign of starvation. Isotope analysis of their teeth and bones indicated a rich, protein-laden diet, meat, fish, and dairy, up until their deaths. In contrast, lower-class colonists had to survive on corn and grain, or sometimes nothing at all. Subsequently, evidence of disease emerged. Forensic analysis of numerous skeletons from the Jamestown site revealed indications of scurvy, evident in the porous bone texture resulting from a deficiency in vitamin C, rickets, stemming from a lack of vitamin D, likely due to insufficient sunlight and poor diet, lead poisoning potentially from pewter utensils or tainted water. Many skeletons exhibited signs of periodontal disease, joint inflammation, and reduced bone density, tangible evidence of prolonged suffering. Some had fractures that had never healed correctly. Others displayed symptoms of acute infections that could have led to their demise within days. Most alarmingly, in several shallow graves located outside the church's boundaries, researchers discovered mass burials, some containing multiple bodies hastily discarded, lacking coffins or proper alignment. These were the forgotten souls, the unnamed. They did not receive a ceremonial farewell. They passed away in haste. These physical remnants highlighted a stark social unsettling even in death. While noblemen were afforded sacred burials and religious ceremonies, common laborers, servants, and women were buried in hurried, nameless graves. There was no equality in life, nor was there any in death. DNA has revealed the origins of the settlers. Most were traced back to southern and southeastern England, specifically London, Kent, and Sussex. Their isotopic signatures indicated diets rich in river-based foods and inland protein, suggesting they likely hailed from urban or rural gentry backgrounds. This complex web of scientific findings began to narrate a new tale, not merely of the events in Jamestown, but of the individuals involved, and how class, status, and identity influenced the destinies of all who arrived on its shores. What initially appeared to be a colony of optimistic pioneers soon transformed into a delicate society founded on hierarchy, concealed ideologies, and profound inequality. And the situation was about to become even more complex. One of the high-status skeletons discovered, who was buried with great honor, did not belong to the individual the records indicated. In reality, he was not meant to exist at all. The illegitimate noble. In 2023, just when scientists believed they had unveiled most of Jamestown's mysteries, a groundbreaking DNA discovery unearthed a scandal that had been hidden for over 400 years. Beneath the church floor at James Fort, adjacent to the graves of notable figures such as Reverend Robert Hunt and Sir Ferdinando Wenman, lay the remains of another high-status individual. He was buried with great honor, a ceremonial sash, a coffin, and a revered position beneath the altar, all indicative of his rank. However, there was no name associated with this burial, no headstone, no existing record. Then, the DNA revealed its secrets. Preliminary testing uncovered an unexpected finding. The remains shared a maternal mitochondrial DNA haplotype, H10E, with Sir Ferdinando Wenman, the well-documented noble cousin of Governor Thomas West, Baron de la Warre. This was the initial clue. As historians and geneticists delved further into genealogical records and cross-referenced DNA findings, a name gradually emerged from obscurity: Captain William West. For centuries, he had existed as a phantom in the historical stories only briefly mentioned in passing. No known descendants, no references in noble family trees. Yet, he was buried as if he were a man of privilege. It became clear that the silence had a reason behind it. William West was the illegitimate offspring of Elizabeth West, a noblewoman and the unmarried aunt of Governor Thomas West. In the rigid and status-driven society of 17th century England, being born out of wedlock was a lasting blemish. Aristocratic children born outside of marriage were often discreetly removed from family histories, acknowledged in private, but never in public. They were excluded from inheriting titles, absent from wills, and did not truly belong. However, Captain William West made his way to the New World, likely under the protective eye of his influential relatives. He came not only to contribute to the colony, but perhaps to flee the disgrace of his origins. For him, Jamestown represented more than just a colonial venture. It was a fresh start. His burial indicated that he was held in esteem, at least by those aware of his true background. Yet, the respect he garnered remained concealed. There are no surviving written tributes, no memorial plaques, only bones in a grave, secrets buried in the earth. And now, after 4 centuries, a genetic connection that took everyone by surprise. What adds to the intrigue of his tale is the manner of his burial. In contrast to his Protestant peers, William West was laid to rest with his body oriented east to west, his head facing west and his feet directed east. Typically, in Anglican burials, graves are positioned the other way around, heads to the east so that the deceased can rise facing Jerusalem on Judgment Day. West's burial adhered to Catholic customs, hinting at either a private commitment to Catholicism or the impact of an older, possibly ancestral belief system. This buried contradiction hinted at religious tension among the colony's elite, something long suspected but rarely proven. If true, it would have made William's position even more dangerous. He may have been a nobleman in name, but in faith, birth, and status, he lived on the edge of scandal. Why was his identity buried? The likely answer is control. The Virginia Company and the royal sponsors behind it had no interest in revealing the personal disgraces of their colony's leaders. An illegitimate noble, possibly Catholic, sent off to govern a Protestant colony? It was an image best left unspoken. And yet, 400 years later, it was science, not statecraft, that unearthed the truth. The researchers who matched William's DNA to the West family line used not only mitochondrial sequencing, but historical cross-referencing. An obscure 1616 court record mentioned guardianship arrangements involving Mary Blount, who was Elizabeth West's sister. William was indirectly referenced, not by name, but through property transfers and legal protections. A quiet acknowledgement of a child who couldn't be acknowledged publicly. It wasn't much, but it was enough to confirm that Captain William West, illegitimate son of nobility, had become one of Jamestown's earliest silent leaders. His story is more than a genealogical footnote. It shows that Jamestown wasn't just about survival, it was also about exile, shame, and reinvention. For some, the New World wasn't a land of opportunity, it was a place to bury the past. And now, with the help of forensic science, we're finally hearing the stories they tried to silence. But this was not the only cover-up. In fact, the entire record of Jamestown, the glorious beginnings of English America, was carefully curated. What the Virginia Company shared with the world was only part of the truth. The rest was locked in graves, masked by ceremony, and edited from letters home. Until now, the buried truth, history, as we often say, is written by the victors. But in Jamestown's case, it was also written by investors, politicians, and clerics, all of whom had a vested interest in shaping the colony's image. From the moment the first ships docked, the Virginia Company wasn't just in the business of settling land. It was selling a story, one of triumph, one of progress, one of divine destiny. What actually happened at Jamestown, the starvation, the mutinies, the religious rifts, the cannibalism was too grotesque, too shameful to publish in London pamphlets or present to King James. And so, much of it was quietly omitted. Official reports focused on construction efforts, diplomatic exchanges with native tribes, and the hopeful arrival of new settlers. Even when hundreds were dying from dysentery, salt poisoning, or starvation, the public emphasized growth and potential. It was a carefully crafted illusion, designed to keep the money flowing and the myth alive. The truth, however, was buried beneath layers of euphemism and silence. Take the starving time, for instance. While George Percy's private journal explicitly described settlers digging up the dead to eat them, the Virginia Company's letters back to England simply said the colony had endured a hard season. Survivors like John Smith, who had clashed with fellow leaders and saw the worst of the chaos, chose his words carefully. He hinted at hardship, but never detailed cannibalism. He couldn't, not if he wanted to protect his own name or secure more ships. Even the religious dimension of the colony was sanitized. Reverend Robert Hunt, the colony's chaplain, was remembered as a unifying force, and rightly so. But his successor and other clergymen were faced with divided loyalties. Some settlers, like Gabriel Archer and possibly William West, may have harbored Catholic sympathies, a dangerous offense under the strict Protestant regime of King James I. In England, Catholicism was still associated with treason, especially after the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. A Catholic buried in the Anglican colony's church would have caused outrage and jeopardized royal support. No wonder Archer was buried facing east, perhaps in silent defiance or in secret adherence to the old ways. No wonder no one spoke of it. And then there was William West, the nobleman with no name, illegitimate, possibly Catholic, and buried with honor. His very existence threatened the carefully controlled record of Jamestown as a beacon of moral and religious order. To acknowledge him would have meant acknowledging that the elite carried their sins across the sea and that exile was the cost of silence. This pattern of omission extended beyond individuals. Native relations, for example, were portrayed as cooperative and civil, especially when Pocahontas was baptized and married to John Rolfe. But behind the scenes, tensions with the Powhatan Confederacy were mounting. The English had raided villages, burned crops, and kidnapped children to force obedience. In 1622, just 15 years after the founding, the Powhatan launched a massive assault, killing over 1/4 of the English population in a single day. And still, the Virginia Company's response was spin. The massacre, they claimed, was a divine test, proof that they needed to redouble their civilizing mission. The reality that they had provoked violence through arrogance and expansion was left unsaid. But time has a way of unearthing what words conceal. Today, the bones speak louder than proclamations. Archaeological digs have uncovered hurried burials, mass graves, and evidence of violence, contradicting centuries of official optimism. DNA has exposed hidden family lines and class-based divisions. Isotope analysis has revealed who starved, who survived, and who was never supposed to be there in the first place. What we now know is this: Jamestown was not just the birthplace of English America. It was a crucible of human fragility, political manipulation, and cultural erasure. For every nobleman buried with a sash, there was a servant buried without a name. For every prayer offered in public, there was a secret kept in private. And for every polished report sent across the Atlantic, there was a body in the ground telling a far different story. The myth of Jamestown was built to inspire confidence and pride. But the truth, the real, physical, provable truth, tells a story of hunger, betrayal, survival, and shame. And now, after centuries of silence, that truth is being heard. The legacy of Jamestown. Jamestown's myth was once simple: a brave beginning, a bold people, and the foundation of what would become the United States. But the reality is much more complex and infinitely more human. The bones buried beneath the church, the cellar pit, and the fort walls have started to speak. And what they tell us is that the birth of English America was not just about survival. It was about inequality, fear, secrecy, and resilience. The most haunting of all these voices may still be Jane's. Her face, reconstructed from the butchered remains of a 14-year-old girl, now gazes out from exhibits and textbooks, a symbol not just of tragedy, but of unspoken desperation. She didn't choose this legacy, but her story, uncovered centuries later, has helped historians finally accept what they long resisted. Cannibalism happened. It wasn't a rumor. It was reality. Just yards away from Jane's Pit, the graves of Robert Hunt, Gabriel Archer, Ferdinando Wenman, and William West offer another kind of testimony. Their bones speak of class privilege, political power, and spiritual conflict. They were buried with care, in coffins, with artifacts, near the altar. Their diets were richer, their lives are longer. Yet even in this sacred space, science exposed what the written record chose to ignore. One had hidden Catholic ties. Another, William West, wasn't even supposed to exist. His DNA, matched to the noble West family, revealed him as an illegitimate son, a political embarrassment smuggled into the colony under the cloak of exile. And still, his burial honored him. In silence, they protected their own. And for 400 years, his name was lost until ancient DNA restored it. These stories are not just historical footnotes. They challenge the way we interpret founding history, not just in Jamestown, but everywhere. Because behind every official account is an unofficial truth. Behind every monument is someone who was never commemorated. And what of the others? The unnamed laborers, the women whose bones were tossed into mass graves, the children whose short lives went unrecorded. They built Jamestown too. They died for it. But their stories were not carved into stone or chronicled in court documents. Only science now can help recover their names. Today, the Jamestown Rediscovery Project, in partnership with the Smithsonian Institution and other forensic labs, continues to excavate, test, and document these remains. More than 3,000 artifacts have been unearthed: tools, weapons, religious items, fragments of daily life. Each one fills in another piece of the puzzle. But the discoveries go beyond the physical. They speak to something much deeper: the human condition, the will to live, the choices made in darkness, the decisions that societies, then and now, try to forget. The remains found at Jamestown are not just archaeological finds. They are evidence of our moral thresholds, our buried histories, and our complex beginnings. They reveal how people, even when pushed to the brink of death, clung to their beliefs, their social structures, and their secrets. They show us that America's earliest settlers were not mythical heroes. They were flawed, frightened, desperate, and deeply human. In this light, Jamestown is no longer just the first permanent English colony in America. It becomes a mirror, reflecting the dangers of blind ambition, unchecked hierarchy, and forced silence. Yet amid the darkness, there is clarity. The scientific tools of our age, DNA sequencing, isotope analysis, 3D reconstruction, have brought the past back to life in ways unimaginable even 50 years ago. They've allowed us to hear from those who left no voice behind and to question the stories that once seemed unshakable. As the bones continue to yield their secrets, we're left with a question that extends beyond Jamestown. What else have we buried? And what happens when we're finally brave enough to dig it up? Because in the end, history doesn't rest in peace. It rests in pieces, and every fragment has something to say. Because history isn't finished with Jamestown. New technologies, from 3D facial reconstruction to genome-wide sequencing, are allowing researchers to uncover not only how people died, but how they lived, what they believed, and what choices shaped their fates. With each test tube and soil sample, the past grows less abstract. The myth of Jamestown becomes flesh and blood. And this isn't just about settlers. The bones may tell the English story, but they sit atop native land, the homeland of the Powhatan Confederacy, whose history was sidelined in the founding myth. Today, descendants of those tribes are pushing for a broader telling of the story, one that doesn't reduce them to footnotes or mere obstacles in the settlers' journey. The same science that revived Jane and exposed West's lineage may someday recover lost native perspectives, whether through artifacts, landscapes, or even ancient remains. History, for so long told from one point of view, is being democratized. As one archaeologist put it, the ground doesn't lie, it just waits. Even more compelling is how Jamestown's revision echoes global patterns. Around the world, DNA is overturning historical records, exposing secret paternity, long-denied migrations, or buried atrocities. There's also a cultural shift in how we think about memory itself. Where past generations might have glorified Jamestown as the heroic beginning of America, modern historians and museum curators are asking harder questions. At what cost? Who got to speak? And who got silenced? Museums like the Archaearium at Jamestown and exhibits across the US and UK are now reframing the story, not to erase the past, but to tell it honestly. Jane's skull is not just a relic, it's a warning. William West's grave isn't just noble, it's political. These aren't just dead bodies, they're truth-tellers. Jamestown offers a crucial lesson. The story of our beginnings are not mere fairy tales. They are genuine, often raw, and at times quite harsh. However, confronting these stories with courage and honesty preserves our legacy. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.